The story begins with a man who had everything money could buy, yet the one thing he truly depended on was something he believed was replaceable. Harrison Vale stood at the highest glass balcony of his Manhattan penthouse each morning, watching the city bend itself into motion beneath him. From 48 floors above the noise, he measured his life in clean lines, controlled schedules, and profitable outcomes. He was a self-made tech billionaire whose name traveled faster than headlines and whose decisions moved markets. Precision had built his empire. Discipline had protected it, and distance had preserved him. He believed emotions complicated systems. He believed loyalty was contractual. He believed efficiency was the highest form of respect. That belief had shaped not only his corporation, but also the silent architecture of his home. For 18 years, Evelyn Carter had walked through the private corridors of his estate with a steadiness that never demanded recognition. She arrived before sunrise and often left long after the skyline dimmed into night. She carried herself with quiet authority, her presence measured, her posture composed. Her uniform was always immaculate, but it was never the fabric that defined her. It was her consistency, her steadiness, the kind of reliability that did not fluctuate with moods or seasons. Harrison never saw her as extraordinary. He saw her as dependable. In his world, that distinction mattered. Evelyn managed more than dust and marble. She managed rhythm. The rhythm of Harrison's mornings, when his espresso was placed precisely to the right of his tablet. The rhythm of his board, call reminders, printed in discreet folders before he even requested them. The rhythm of the estate's staff, whose coordination depended not on fear of Harrison's authority, but on respect for Evelyn's quiet leadership. She understood the house like a living organism. She knew which light fixtures flickered before failing. She knew which investors preferred still water over sparkling when they visited. She knew which hallways carried echoes late at night and which corners felt heavy after long days. Most importantly, she knew the fragile heart of the child who slept upstairs. After Harrison's wife passed away, grief did not knock loudly in the Vale mansion. It settled like dust over every surface. Ariel Vale had been 8 years old when silence replaced her mother's laughter. Harrison responded the only way he understood how: by working more, expanding faster, achieving louder. He told himself provision was protection. Evelyn understood something different. She understood that grief in a child does not respond to stock valuations or public statements. It responds to presence. She adjusted Ariel's routine without announcement. She braided her hair when she could not sleep. She left soft lamps glowing in hallways so shadows would not stretch too far. She learned the songs Ariel's mother used to hum and played them quietly during homework hours. She never attempted to replace what was lost. She simply refused to let loneliness grow roots. Harrison observed these gestures, but categorized them as job performance. In his mind, Evelyn was fulfilling expectations. He did not ask how many extra hours she remained when Ariel cried at night. He did not notice the personal sacrifices that lived behind her steady expression. He did not see that she shielded him as much as she shielded his daughter. Years earlier, during a delicate corporate negotiation, a private incident at the mansion threatened to leak to the press. A misplaced guest, a misunderstood encounter, a potential scandal that could have fractured his reputation. Evelyn handled the situation before it reached headlines. She rearranged timelines, redirected inquiries, and preserved his public image without ever requesting acknowledgement. Harrison remembered the outcome, not the guardian. That was the pattern. She absorbed instability so he could appear unshaken. The estate staff relied on her guidance more than they relied on Harrison's authority. Vendors trusted her word. Security consulted her instincts. She was the quiet center of a spinning environment, but Harrison interpreted her influence as operational convenience. In his mind, loyalty came with employment. It was purchased along with the contract. Over time, external pressures began whispering into Harrison's perception. Board members questioned unnecessary domestic expenditures. Investors visiting the estate made subtle remarks about modernization. They described elite households in Silicon Valley that operated with rotating professional teams, interior consultants, image coordinators. One executive commented that long-term household staff gave an outdated impression. Another suggested that refined branding extended into private life. Harrison listened. He had built his fortune by anticipating perception shifts before competitors recognized them. He adapted early. He modernized aggressively. The idea that his personal residence reflected anything less than cutting-edge sophistication unsettled him more than he admitted. He began reviewing household expenses with the same scrutiny he applied to corporate budgets. Efficiency charts replaced familiarity. Metrics replaced memory. He told himself that emotional attachment to staff signaled weakness. Professional environments required evolution. He convinced himself that loyalty was admirable, but replaceable. In the language of business, redundancy ensured stability. What he failed to understand was that Evelyn's presence was not redundant. It was foundational. Ariel sensed changes before anyone articulated them. Children detect tension long before adults admit it exists. She noticed her father studying spreadsheets at the dinner table instead of listening. She noticed Evelyn watching quietly from doorways, her expression unreadable but heavier. The house, once warm in its stillness, began to feel evaluated. Harrison mistook modernization for progress. He mistook polish for improvement. He mistook silence for agreement. One evening, as city lights shimmered across the Hudson, Harrison reviewed a proposal from a luxury staffing consultancy. The document promised refined personnel, globally trained managers, seamless presentation. It spoke of elite discretion and aesthetic alignment. It described transformation. He glanced briefly at Evelyn moving through the hallway, adjusting a painting that had hung there since before his company went public. She stepped back to ensure it aligned perfectly with the molding. She had memorized every corner of that estate, every emotional fracture hidden behind expensive walls. Harrison closed the proposal and exhaled slowly. In his mind, he was not removing loyalty. He was upgrading infrastructure. He did not consider that Ariel's laughter had gradually returned because of the woman he was evaluating as an expense. He did not consider that stability, once disrupted, does not restore itself on command. He believed his authority could redesign any structure. The following morning, before the city had fully awakened, Harrison drafted a quiet internal directive for household restructuring. It was concise, strategic, rational. He convinced himself it was necessary evolution. What he did not know was that the signature he placed at the bottom of that document would fracture more than routine. It would unravel the emotional foundation of his home in ways he could not yet measure. And by the time he understood what he had replaced, it would already be gone. The replacement happened without warning, not because Evelyn failed, but because Harrison wanted something that looked more impressive. In his mind, a transformation did not require conflict. It required decisiveness. He had built an empire by acting before emotions could interfere, and he approached his home with the same executive detachment he brought into boardrooms. The luxury staffing agency he contacted specialized in elite image refinement. Their portfolio boasted diplomats, global CEOs, and discreet celebrity estates. They promised precision, modernization, and seamless authority. Harrison saw alignment. He saw elevation. He did not see loss. When Lillian Graves entered the Vale estate for the first time, she carried no hesitation in her posture. Her resume was immaculate, her credentials international, her demeanor refined to a professional sharpness that bordered on clinical. She analyzed the architecture with an appraiser's eye, noted inefficiencies in staff distribution, and outlined structural adjustments before the introductory meeting concluded. Harrison admired her clarity. She spoke in terms of systems, benchmarks, optimization. She described the estate not as a home, but as an operational ecosystem requiring recalibration. The contrast between Lillian and Evelyn was immediate yet unspoken. Evelyn moved through the mansion with familiarity, her gestures softened by years of memory embedded in every corridor. Lillian moved with calculated distance, careful not to touch what she had not cataloged. Where Evelyn adjusted spaces to reflect comfort, Lillian measured them for symmetry. Where Evelyn anticipated emotional needs, Lillian prioritized procedural compliance. Harrison interpreted the difference as progress. He scheduled the termination meeting with Evelyn early in the morning, framing it as restructuring rather than dismissal. He spoke in the language of strategy, of evolution, of modernization. He told himself honesty required detachment. He believed confrontation would complicate efficiency. Evelyn listened without interruption. Her expression remained composed, her posture unwavering. She did not defend herself. She did not ask for reconsideration. She simply absorbed the information with a dignity that unsettled the air between them. Harrison interpreted her silence as acceptance. He did not understand that silence can carry weight far heavier than protest. Ariel sensed something shifting long before the formal announcement reached her. She noticed unfamiliar footsteps echoing through the hallways. She observed staff exchanging cautious glances. She saw Lillian reviewing inventory lists with a tablet in hand. When Evelyn began placing her personal items into a modest cardboard box, Ariel stood at the doorway without speaking. The child's confusion lingered in the space, unanswered. Harrison chose not to explain. He convinced himself children adapt quickly. He labeled the transition as necessary growth. Evelyn packed slowly, folding each uniform with deliberate care. She paused briefly at the small, framed photograph of Ariel from years earlier, taken during a quiet afternoon in the garden. She placed it gently into her bag without asking permission. There was no bitterness in her movements, only a restrained sorrow that refused to spill outward. For 18 years, she had poured steadiness into a household that rarely acknowledged her foundation. Now she exited without demanding gratitude. What Harrison did not revisit in that moment was the past incident that had nearly dismantled his reputation. Years earlier, during a high-profile investor gathering, a misunderstanding involving a private guest threatened to escalate into scandal. It was Evelyn who intervened quietly, redirecting narratives before they could fracture his public image. She shielded him without exposing his vulnerability. She absorbed risk so he could remain untarnished. He remembered the preserved reputation, not the protector who ensured it. Within days of Lillian's appointment, the estate began transforming. Sentimental objects tied to Harrison's late wife were removed from common areas in favor of minimalist arrangements. Family photographs were relocated to private storage to maintain aesthetic cohesion. The living room, once softened by memory, now reflected curated sterility. Harrison admired the polished surfaces and interpreted the visual sharpness as advancement. Ariel reacted differently. She grew quieter. She spent longer hours in her room. She avoided the main hallways where familiar objects once offered comfort. Lillian enforced structured mealtimes, restricted informal staff interactions, and introduced procedural checklists for domestic flow. Efficiency increased, warmth decreased. The household staff adjusted cautiously, their morale thinning under new expectations that valued precision over loyalty. Harrison initially felt pride when hosting a small corporate dinner under the new arrangement. The lighting was immaculate. The service synchronized. The presentation flawless. Investors complimented the refinement. They described the estate as modern, aligned with Harrison's public image. He interpreted their approval as confirmation of correct judgment. Yet subtle fractures began surfacing beneath the surface order. Dinner conversations shortened. Ariel stopped volunteering details about her day. The once natural rhythm of the home shifted into mechanical repetition. Laughter became rare. Silence no longer felt restful. It felt hollow. Harrison noticed the change but categorized it as transitional discomfort. He believed stability would recalibrate. 3 weeks passed. The estate functioned with measurable efficiency. Reports were cleaner. Staff schedules tighter. Expenses reduced. Harrison's professional instincts assured him the decision was justified. Yet at night, as he returned from late meetings, he began noticing something intangible yet persistent. The foyer lights remained on, but the energy felt altered. The air lacked familiarity. Previously, no matter how late he arrived, Ariel would wait at the top of the staircase, pretending she had not been counting the minutes. Evelyn had orchestrated those small reunions, ensuring the child felt seen before sleep. Harrison had considered them routine. He now walked through the silent hallway alone. On the 21st night after Evelyn's departure, Harrison paused at the base of the stairs. The house stood immaculate, controlled, perfectly arranged. He listened for movement. There was none. He glanced upward, expecting the faint outline of his daughter's figure leaning against the railing. The staircase remained empty. For the first time, a quiet discomfort unsettled him. It was not loud enough to classify as regret, not sharp enough to demand correction. But it lingered. And as he stood there in the pristine silence of his upgraded home, Harrison realized something small yet deeply unsettling. Ariel no longer waited for him at night. The mansion became quieter, not peaceful but hollow. Its marble floors still reflected chandelier light with flawless brilliance, and every surface gleamed under Lillian Graves's precise management. Yet the atmosphere had shifted into something intangible and thin. The estate functioned with the efficiency of a luxury hotel, but it no longer breathed like a home. Harrison Vale noticed the silence in passing, though he refused to name it. To him, discomfort was often a temporary adjustment before improvement fully settled in. Ariel's emotional decline did not happen in dramatic waves. It unfolded gradually, like a tide pulling back farther each day. She stopped lingering in the common rooms. She retreated to her bedroom earlier than usual. Her laughter, once cautious but returning after years of grief, vanished almost entirely. Lillian enforced structured routines with unwavering discipline. Homework hours were timed precisely. Screen usage was regulated. Bedtimes were fixed without flexibility. On paper, the structure appeared ideal. In practice, it lacked warmth. Lillian understood organization, not vulnerability. When Ariel hesitated before entering the dining room, Lillian interpreted it as defiance rather than quiet sadness. When the child avoided eye contact, it was documented as mood instability rather than emotional confusion. The difference between management and care revealed itself in small, almost invisible ways. Harrison, meanwhile, became busier. A pending merger demanded attention, and a new competitor threatened market disruption. He extended his office hours, convinced that securing his corporate future justified temporary distance at home. He interpreted Ariel's withdrawal as adolescent adjustment. He trusted the new structure to handle domestic order while he focused on expansion. Yet subtle mistakes began surfacing in the estate's operation. A confidential legal folder was misplaced for several hours before being found in the wrong study drawer. A board call reminder failed to sync with his calendar, forcing him to join late. A shipment of documents was delivered to the wrong address due to a minor scheduling oversight. None of the errors were catastrophic, but they were unusual. Harrison's life had operated with near mechanical precision for years. What he slowly began to recognize, though he did not articulate it aloud, was that Evelyn Carter had memorized his world in ways no digital system could replicate. She knew which contracts required physical signatures before electronic confirmation. She knew which board members reacted poorly to delayed responses. She knew that Harrison preferred silence before major negotiations and ensured no interruptions occurred during those windows. Her knowledge had not been written into manuals. It had been absorbed through loyalty and long observation. Without her, minor disruptions multiplied. Harrison's insomnia returned after years of relative control. He found himself awake at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling of his meticulously designed bedroom, listening to the faint hum of the city below. The house lights remained on in strategic places for aesthetic continuity, but they no longer offered comfort. They illuminated emptiness. At the same time, tensions rose within his corporation. Rumors circulated about instability in leadership focus. A board member questioned whether Harrison was stretching himself too thin. Investors began scrutinizing minor delays more aggressively than before. The alignment he once maintained between personal control and professional dominance started to fracture in subtle, unspoken ways. The mansion's brightness felt artificial. Light filled every hallway, yet the warmth had thinned. Staff members moved cautiously under Lillian's watchful eye. Efficiency reports were filed weekly. Adjustments were documented. But morale declined quietly. Harrison overheard two longtime staff members speaking in hushed tones near the service corridor one evening. They compared the new order to the previous one, their voices careful but heavy with implication. They did not mention Evelyn by name at first, yet her absence hovered between them. Harrison paused but did not confront them. He dismissed the comparison internally as resistance to change. Loyalty to the past, that he believed, often interfered with progress. Admitting doubt would require acknowledging that he may have miscalculated. Psychological denial settled in as a protective shield. Harrison reassured himself that growth always feels uncomfortable at first. He convinced himself that Ariel's silence would eventually recalibrate. He reviewed performance charts and budget improvements as evidence of correctness. Numbers provided comfort that emotions could not challenge. One evening, while passing through the west hallway, Harrison paused in front of a storage cabinet recently reorganized by Lillian. The faint scent of lavender lingered inside, unexpected and familiar. It triggered a memory he had not revisited in years. After his wife's funeral, Ariel had refused to leave her bedroom for days. It was Evelyn, who sat quietly outside the door, not forcing conversation, not insisting on compliance. She had placed warm tea on the nightstand and left handwritten encouragement cards beneath Ariel's pillow. Slowly, patiently, she guided the child back into the light without drawing attention to herself. Harrison felt a brief flicker of discomfort at the memory. He remembered observing from a distance, grateful but detached. He had told himself that hiring capable staff was responsible parenting. He had never considered that emotional labor could not be outsourced without consequence. The flicker faded as quickly as it appeared. Harrison straightened his posture and returned to his office, pushing the thought aside. Reflection felt inefficient. Regret felt unproductive. He told himself the house was functioning, the business stable, the transition successful. Yet Ariel's school reports began arriving with subtle concerns. Participation declined. Focus diminished. Assignments were incomplete. Teachers noted withdrawal in group activities. Harrison skimmed the comments between meetings, attributing the shift to adolescence. He signed acknowledgement forms without scheduling follow-ups. The silence at dinner deepened. Forks touched plates with mechanical rhythm. Lillian monitored table etiquette with strict attention. Ariel responded to questions with minimal words, her voice soft and distant. Harrison interpreted her quietness as maturity rather than sadness. 3 weeks after Evelyn's departure, the mansion stood more organized than ever. Every object had designated placement, every routine documented, every staff member aligned with protocol. Yet the foundation beneath the order had weakened. Late one afternoon, as Harrison prepared to leave for a strategy session, his phone vibrated with an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, assuming it was another vendor. Instead, he answered. The voice on the other end introduced itself as Ariel's homeroom teacher. The tone was calm but urgent. There had been an incident at school. They requested an immediate meeting. Harrison's grit tightened slightly around the phone. For the first time since restructuring his household, a sensation pierced through his denial. Something serious had happened, and he could no longer categorize it as adjustment. The cost of replacing loyalty revealed itself not in money, but in damage. Harrison Vale entered the private office at Ariel's school with the same composure he carried into investor negotiations, yet the atmosphere inside the room felt different from any corporate setting he had mastered. The counselor's tone was measured, careful not to accuse yet impossible to misinterpret. Ariel had experienced an emotional breakdown during class. It had not been disruptive in a loud or dramatic way. It had been quiet, overwhelming, and deeply concerning. She had withdrawn from a group presentation, her breathing uneven, her focus fractured. When gently encouraged to speak, she confessed something simple yet devastating. She felt abandoned, not physically, emotionally. The word lingered in the room longer than any financial statistic ever had in Harrison's life. The counselor spoke with professional restraint, but her implications were clear. Children often respond to changes at home with internalized distress. Stability, she explained, was not only structural but emotional. Harrison felt a subtle tightening in his chest, not from guilt yet, but from exposure. The suggestion that his home lacked stability challenged the narrative he had constructed. He had provided luxury, protection, opportunity. He had upgraded systems, refined environments. How could instability exist inside such order? He responded with polished assurance, explaining recent household adjustments as modernization rather than disruption. He framed Ariel's reaction as transitional sensitivity. The counselor listened carefully, but her expression did not fully align with his explanation. For the first time, Harrison sensed that his authority did not automatically define truth. As he exited the school building, a deeper concern emerged. Public image had always been an invisible asset in his empire. Any perception of personal instability could ripple outward. The technology sector admired resilience and control. The headlines did not differentiate between professional strength and private fracture. Harrison's rival Malcolm Pierce had been searching for leverage during ongoing merger talks. Within days of the school meeting, subtle rumors began circulating in financial circles. Anonymous commentary questioned whether Harrison's focus was divided. Speculation about personal turbulence appeared in niche investor blogs. None of the rumors were explicit. None confirmed anything tangible. But doubt, once seated, rarely required proof. Board members requested additional performance assurances. One investor postponed a meeting, citing scheduling conflicts that felt manufactured. Harrison recognized the pattern. Perception was shifting. At home, Lillian maintained procedural authority with increased firmness. When Ariel returned from school the day after the breakdown, she moved slowly through the foyer. Her posture diminished. Lillian approached the situation with structured guidance, recommending journaling exercises and revised daily schedules. She implemented tighter time management, believing discipline restored control. What she failed to offer was reassurance without evaluation. That evening, Ariel retreated to her room earlier than usual. Harrison observed the closed door from the hallway, but did not knock. He rationalized that space signaled maturity. He told himself she would recalibrate. Lillian reported that routines were being followed. The house appeared calm, yet beneath the calm, cracks widened. Harrison began connecting fragments he had previously dismissed. The silence at dinner, the absence at the staircase, the counselor's measured concern, the investor hesitation. Each detail alone seemed minor. Together they formed a pattern. Late one night, unable to sleep, Harrison wandered into a storage cabinet recently reorganized during Lillian's restructuring. He searched for a misplaced document, but instead discovered something unexpected. Tucked inside the back corner of a drawer was a small stack of folded paper, delicate and carefully arranged. He recognized the handwriting immediately. That Evelyn had once left handwritten encouragement notes for Ariel during the months following her mother's death. Short messages reminding her of her strength. Gentle affirmations about resilience. Promises that she was never alone. Harrison had not realized they continued long after the initial grief subsided. He unfolded one of the notes. The ink was steady, the words simple but deliberate. It spoke of courage during difficult transitions. It reminded Ariel that even when rooms felt empty, love did not disappear. Harrison stood in the dim light of the hallway, reading the note twice. For the first time, a sharp awareness pierced through his rational defenses. Evelyn had not merely managed tasks. She had managed emotional continuity. The realization did not erupt dramatically. It settled slowly, like a weight redistributing inside his chest. He began recalling specific evenings when Ariel's laughter returned unexpectedly. He remembered the subtle warmth that once lingered in the living room. He recognized that those shifts had not occurred naturally. They had been nurtured. Guilt surfaced quietly. It was unfamiliar terrain for a man accustomed to decisive confidence. He replayed the termination meeting in his mind, examining Evelyn's composed silence. Had there been disappointment in her eyes? Had he mistaken dignity for indifference? The first wave of regret arrived, but ego quickly followed. Harrison resisted the impulse to interpret his decision as error. Leaders could not afford impulsive reversals. Admitting miscalculation might validate the doubts circulating among investors. He convinced himself that emotional discomfort did not necessarily equate to strategic failure. Instead of accountability, he pursued compensation. He ordered renovations to Ariel's room, adding custom furnishings and advanced technology designed to impress. He arranged a weekend trip to a private resort, believing environment could substitute for presence. He increased charitable donations to educational foundations, attempting to reinforce his identity as responsible father and visionary leader. Ariel accepted the gifts with polite gratitude, but her eyes remained distant. The renovations felt curated, not comforting. The resort weekend passed with structured activities but minimal connection. Harrison observed the gap but reframed it as temporary. Meanwhile, business pressures intensified. Malcolm Pierce's subtle campaign gained traction, hinting that Harrison's leadership might be compromised by personal distraction. The board demanded sharper performance metrics. Harrison worked longer hours, attempting to outpace perception. One evening, while reviewing internal staffing files, Harrison made an unexpected discovery. He had assumed Evelyn transitioned seamlessly into another high-profile position. Instead, records showed no forwarding employment reference. The luxury agency had not placed her elsewhere. There was no new contract filed under her name within the city's network of elite households. Concern replaced curiosity. The Harrison instructed a discreet inquiry through a trusted contact. The report returned with a detail he had not anticipated. Evelyn Carter had not accepted another job in Manhattan. She had vacated her apartment quietly and left no public trace of her next destination. She had disappeared from the city entirely. For the first time since signing the restructuring directive, Harrison felt the full weight of uncertainty. He had treated loyalty as replaceable, assuming it would continue existing somewhere else without consequence. Now, the one person who had anchored his household and protected his reputation was beyond immediate reach, and he realized that repair might not be as simple as another executive decision. For the first time in his life, Harrison Vale had to pursue something he could not buy. The realization unsettled him more than market volatility or public doubt ever had. He had built his identity around acquisition, companies, influence, solutions. Every obstacle he had faced eventually yielded to strategy or capital. But Evelyn Carter's absence did not respond to either. He initiated the search discreetly. No formal inquiries through corporate channels, no visible signals that might reach the press. He contacted a retired security consultant who had once handled sensitive matters for the Vale estate. The investigation was quiet, respectful, limited to public records and minimal personal outreach. Harrison justified the action as closure, though beneath that word lingered something heavier. Within a week, the information arrived. Evelyn had not vanished into anonymity. She had returned to Baltimore, to a modest neighborhood far removed from Manhattan's glass towers. The address led to a narrow brick home on a quiet street lined with aging sycamore trees. Property records showed the house belonged to her late parents. She had never sold it. Further inquiry revealed another detail Harrison had not known. Evelyn's older brother had been diagnosed with a degenerative illness months before her departure. His condition required daily assistance, medication management, and steady care. She had left New York without announcement, not out of bitterness, but responsibility. Harrison read the report twice, absorbing what it implied. Evelyn had never depended on his wealth. She had chosen to work in his home for 18 years not because she lacked alternatives, but because she believed in the stability she provided. Her departure was not a professional setback. It was a personal shift toward family duty. The contrast between their worlds sharpened his awareness. Harrison presided over an empire valued in billions, operating from penthouses and executive towers. Evelyn returned willingly to a small brick house where financial margins were tight, but dignity remained intact. He measured power through expansion. She measured strength through commitment. That evening, as the city's skyline flickered outside his office windows, Ariel entered quietly. She rarely initiated conversation anymore, which made her presence deliberate. She stood near his desk, hesitating before speaking. When she finally expressed that she missed Evelyn, the words carried more weight than any corporate criticism he had endured. She did not frame her grief as nostalgia. She described a feeling of safety that had disappeared. She admitted she felt alone even inside a full house. The confession pierced through Harrison's rational defenses. He saw not rebellion, not adolescence, but dependence he had underestimated. Evelyn had not only managed routines, she had anchored Ariel's emotional world. Corporate stress intensified simultaneously. Malcolm Pierce's maneuvering gained momentum, and board members scheduled emergency reviews to assess leadership continuity. Harrison felt pressure closing in from both private and public fronts. The empire he had fortified with precision now seemed fragile at its edges. Inside him, pride and regret collided. Pride insisted that decisions once made should not be reversed impulsively. Regret questioned whether the original decision had been wise at all. Harrison began replaying small moments he had dismissed over the years. Evelyn standing quietly after long evenings, waiting to ensure Ariel had fallen asleep before leaving. Evelyn adjusting schedules without seeking praise. Evelyn maintaining composure during the past scandal that could have shattered his reputation. He had interpreted those acts as professional obligation. Now they appeared as deliberate loyalty. The unraveling of his self-image began subtly. He had always considered himself a fair employer, generous with compensation, respectful of boundaries. Yet fairness without recognition of humanity felt hollow. He realized he had mistaken financial generosity for moral awareness. One evening, Harrison requested a private meeting with Lillian in his study. He asked about Ariel's recent behavior, about her emotional state beyond routines and compliance charts. Lillian responded with structured observations, attendance records, time allocations, behavioral adjustments. Her analysis was technically thorough, yet emotionally absent. She recommended stricter consistency and reduced indulgence. Harrison listened carefully, but something inside him shifted. Competence, he began to understand, was not loyalty. Precision was not presence. A well-managed environment could still be emotionally vacant. Lillian had delivered exactly what he requested: efficiency, modernization, alignment with elite standards. The failure was not hers. It was his evaluation criteria. As he walked through the mansion later that night, Harrison noticed details previously overlooked. The grand staircase where Ariel once waited felt cavernous. The living room, redesigned for aesthetic cohesion, seemed detached from memory. The air held no trace of lavender anymore. He began questioning not just the staffing decision, but the values that shaped it. Had he equated modernization with superiority? Had he allowed external perception to override internal stability? The questions unsettled him because they reached beyond Evelyn. They challenged the framework through which he measured success. He returned to Ariel's bedroom doorway and observed her asleep, a faint crease of tension still visible on her brow. He imagined Evelyn sitting quietly in the Baltimore house, tending to her brother without complaint. The image humbled him in a way boardroom criticism never had. The next morning, Harrison instructed his assistant to clear his schedule for 48 hours. Officially, he cited strategic planning. Unofficially, he reviewed flight paths to Baltimore. He did not announce his intentions to the board, nor did he consult advisors. This decision did not belong to shareholders. As the private jet prepared for departure, Harrison stood alone on the tarmac, the hum of engines building beneath him. He carried no elaborate plan, no guaranteed outcome. He understood that apology could not be transactional. Redemption, if possible, required humility he had rarely exercised. He stepped onto the aircraft uncertain of reception. He did not know whether Evelyn would agree to meet him. He did not know whether she would listen. For the first time in his carefully controlled life, Harrison Vale moved toward something without assurance of success. And as the jet lifted into the sky toward Baltimore, he confronted a truth more unsettling than any market threat. Some things, once dismissed as replaceable, may never agree to return. Redemption required humility, something Harrison Vale had rarely practiced. As his car turned onto the quiet Baltimore street lined with aging trees and closely built brick homes, the scale of his world shifted in ways no financial downturn ever had. The neighborhood was modest but orderly. Front porches carried signs of care rather than wealth. Potted plants rested beside worn steps. Wind chimes stirred lightly in the afternoon air. There was no spectacle, no curated perfection, yet nothing felt neglected. The driver slowed before a narrow brick house with white, framed windows and a small garden enclosed by a simple iron fence. Harrison remained seated for a moment longer than necessary. He had entered high-stakes negotiations in global capitals without hesitation, but stepping onto this sidewalk demanded a different kind of courage. There were no shareholders here, no leverage, no performance metrics. When he finally approached the front door, he noticed the garden first. The flowers were not exotic imports, they were seasonal, practical, carefully maintained. The walkway had been recently swept. Even in modest surroundings, order existed. Not luxury, not excess, just dignity. Evelyn opened the door herself. Time had not altered her composure. She wore simple clothing, her posture steady, her gaze calm but unreadable. There was no visible resentment in her expression, yet there was no warmth either. Only awareness. She stepped aside to allow him inside without ceremony. The house was smaller than any room in his Manhattan estate, yet it felt grounded. Photographs lined the walls, not in decorative symmetry, but in meaningful arrangement. The faint scent of home, cooked food lingered in the air. From a nearby room, he could hear the soft hum of a television playing at low volume. Her brother rested there, partially visible through the doorway, his presence fragile but peaceful. Harrison observed quietly. Nothing about the space suggested struggle, though resources were clearly limited. What stood out most was the atmosphere of self-sufficiency. Evelyn moved through her home with the same confidence she once carried through his mansion. She did not appear displaced. She appeared rooted. Neighbors greeted her by name as they passed the open window. A delivery driver addressed her with familiarity and respect. Harrison recognized something he had never measured before: community regard. In Manhattan, her presence had been defined by employment. Here, it was defined by identity. The realization settled heavily. She had never depended on his wealth to define her worth. She had chosen to work in his home, but her dignity had not been tied to his approval. The balance of power he once assumed now felt distorted. He had believed himself benefactor, provider of opportunity. Yet standing in her living room, he understood that he had been the one benefiting from her loyalty all along. Evelyn invited him to sit at a small wooden table near the kitchen window. The furniture was worn but polished with care. Sunlight filtered through thin curtains, illuminating dust particles that seemed almost suspended in time. Harrison felt exposed in a way that boardroom scrutiny had never achieved. He began speaking, but the words felt unfamiliar. He spoke of restructuring, of miscalculation, of unintended consequences. He avoided excuses, though remnants of pride attempted to surface. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression composed. The absence of reaction intensified his guilt more than confrontation would have. As he continued, Harrison reflected internally on dynamics he had previously ignored. He had replaced a loyal black woman who had anchored his home for nearly 2 decades with a polished professional who aligned better with elite optics. He had justified the change as modernization, but beneath that justification lived unconscious bias. He had valued presentation over presence, efficiency over empathy. He had allowed systemic assumptions about status and refinement to influence a deeply personal decision. The acknowledgement did not erupt dramatically. It unfolded quietly within him. He saw how small his reasons had been when measured against the magnitude of her contribution. Investor comments about image now sounded trivial. Board pressure about household presentation seemed hollow. He had traded authenticity for approval. Harrison felt an internal unraveling, not visible on his face but undeniable in his chest. His empire suddenly appeared less stable than the modest house surrounding him. Wealth had amplified his reach, but it had not strengthened his judgment. He understood that Ariel's healing depended not on luxury upgrades or extravagant gestures, but on restoring trust that had been fractured. He realized something else as well. An apology could not contain conditions. It could not request immediate return or assume forgiveness. It could not be framed as strategic correction. It had to stand alone, unprotected by status. For the first time in years, Harrison allowed silence to stretch without attempting to control it. He looked around the room again, noticing the small details he once overlooked in his own home: a folded blanket placed neatly over a chair, medication schedules written carefully on a notepad, a framed photograph of Evelyn and her brother from decades earlier. Responsibility lived here, but it was chosen, not imposed. He spoke again, this time without corporate language. He acknowledged his failure to recognize her value beyond function. He admitted that his decision had caused harm, not only to her, but to Ariel. He did not offer immediate incentives. He did not propose revised contracts. He simply stated that he had been wrong. Evelyn remained still, her gaze steady. The quiet in the room felt heavier than any accusation. Harrison realized that humility was not a performance, it was surrendering the need to defend oneself. Outside, a neighbor's laughter drifted faintly through the open window. Life continued normally beyond the walls of this reckoning. Harrison understood that redemption, if possible, would require more than a visit. It would demand transformation. Evelyn folded her hands gently on the table, her expression unchanged. She had listened to every word without visible judgment. Harrison waited, uncertain whether silence signaled rejection or contemplation. Then, after a long pause that seemed to suspend time itself, she finally responded. And her answer was not what he expected. Forgiveness is not granted because someone is powerful. It is earned through change. Harrison Vale understood that the moment Evelyn Carter finally spoke inside her modest Baltimore home. Her voice was calm, neither harsh nor accommodating, yet the clarity within it unsettled him more than anger ever could have. She did not refuse him outright, but she did not accept his apology as a transaction either. Her presence communicated something deeper than words. Dignity cannot be rehired casually. She explained, without bitterness, that loyalty is not a uniform one puts back on after dismissal. It is built over time and protected through respect. When that respect is withdrawn, restoration requires more than regret. Harrison listened carefully, recognizing that she was not negotiating salary or status. She was defining boundaries. He left Baltimore with a new understanding that redemption would not be secured by persuasion. It would require structural change. Not symbolic gestures. Not temporary adjustments. Structural change. Back in Manhattan, the mansion felt different to him. For the first time, he observed its systems through a lens of accountability rather than authority. He called a private meeting with Lillian Graves and informed her that the household would undergo reorganization. He did not blame her for the emotional decline, that he acknowledged that she had fulfilled the role he had designed. However, he admitted that the design itself had been flawed. Lillian received the news with professional composure. Her departure was handled respectfully, with full compensation and formal appreciation. Harrison ensured that her exit did not replicate the quiet dismissal he had once imposed on Evelyn. This time, he understood that dignity must be preserved even in transition. The restructuring extended beyond personnel. Harrison redefined the hierarchy of the estate. Rather than positioning management above emotional care, he integrated both into a balanced system. Staff meetings were no longer dominated by efficiency metrics alone. He invited feedback, something he had rarely done within his private domain. He listened to long-serving employees describe how Evelyn's leadership once fostered stability through inclusion rather than intimidation. Public acknowledgement followed. At a corporate charity event, Harrison referenced the contributions of long-term domestic professionals in his own life. He spoke not in vague platitudes, but with specific recognition of unseen labor that sustains powerful households. Though he did not dramatize his past mistake, those who listened carefully sensed a shift in tone. It was no longer the voice of a man defending his decisions. It was the voice of someone reassessing them. Within his corporation, he initiated policy reviews concerning domestic and auxiliary staff treatment across company-sponsored residences. Benefits were expanded. Career development pathways were formalized. Advisory committees were formed to ensure representation from employees often overlooked. Board members initially questioned the necessity of such reforms, but Harrison no longer defended decisions through dominance. He explained them through principle. This transformation began influencing his leadership style more broadly. Meetings once driven by directive authority evolved into collaborative discussions. Harrison noticed that listening did not weaken control, it refined it. Accountability replaced assumption. He asked more questions than he delivered conclusions. Investors, initially wary of his perceived vulnerability, gradually recognized steadiness returning in a different form. At home, Ariel observed the changes quietly. She noticed her father coming home earlier. She saw him lingering in common spaces without distractions. He knocked before entering her room, not out of formality, but respect. Conversations between them lengthened, though they remained gentle and gradual. Trust did not return overnight. It unfolded carefully, like a fragile thread being rewoven. The emotional rebuilding process was not cinematic in grand gestures. It was slow. Harrison attended school meetings without checking his phone. He asked Ariel about her day and listened fully to her answers. He acknowledged when he did not understand something, rather than offering immediate solutions. The house began to feel less mechanical. Staff interactions softened. Laughter returned in small, unexpected moments. Harrison felt the psychological shift within himself. Control had once defined his strength. Now accountability reshaped it. He no longer viewed authority as insulation from criticism. Instead, he understood it as responsibility for consequences. The pride that once prevented correction now gave way to clarity. Weeks passed before he contacted Evelyn again. This time the call carried no urgency, no persuasion. He informed her of the changes implemented, not as evidence to convince her, but as information she deserved. He described the restructuring of the household authority. He mentioned policy reforms at the corporate level. He acknowledged Ariel's progress and her continued longing. There was no expectation embedded in his words, only transparency. Evelyn listened carefully, just as she had in Baltimore. Silence stretched across the distance between Manhattan and her modest home. Harrison did not rush to fill it. He understood that trust required patience. Finally, she agreed to consider returning, not because he requested it, but because she believed Ariel's stability mattered. Yet her acceptance carried a condition that reshaped everything. She would not return as a maid. The statement was not defiant. It was definitive. And Harrison realized that forgiveness, if granted, would not restore the past. It would redefine the future. The position she once held was never employment, it was family. Harrison Vale understood that fully the day Evelyn Carter returned to the Manhattan estate, not as staff reinstated, but as household director, an authority formalized, defined, and respected. The title was not cosmetic. It reflected a structural shift that acknowledged what had always been true. She had long been the emotional architect of the home. Her arrival was not dramatic. There were no headlines, no corporate announcements. Instead, Harrison gathered the household staff in the main living room on a quiet afternoon. Sunlight filtered through restored curtains that once belonged to his late wife, now returned to their original place after months in storage. The room felt different, less curated, more lived in. He addressed the staff without grandeur, outlining the new structure clearly. Evelyn would oversee household operations entirely, the not merely manage tasks but guide culture, coordination, and well-being. Authority would flow through her office, and all procedural adjustments would require her review. The recognition was formal, deliberate, and visible. Evelyn stood composed, accepting the acknowledgement without indulgence. She did not smile widely or dramatize the moment. She simply nodded, aware that respect must be sustained, not celebrated once. Ariel observed from the staircase, and for the first time in months, that her posture carried lightness. The subtle tension that had lived in her shoulders began easing in the days that followed. She resumed spending time in shared spaces. She lingered at dinner rather than retreating early. The return of Evelyn did not erase pain instantly, but it reintroduced familiarity that had once anchored her. The mansion itself seemed to respond. The scent of lavender returned faintly to hallways. Family photographs were restored thoughtfully, not as decorative nostalgia, but as affirmation of memory. The piano in the sitting room, once silent, began carrying soft notes in the evenings as Ariel practiced again. Harrison noticed how warmth resurfaced without disrupting order. Efficiency remained, but it no longer suffocated emotion. Meetings at the estate incorporated both precision and presence. Staff morale improved, not because policies demanded it, but because leadership felt human again. In a nationally televised corporate interview weeks later, Harrison was asked about recent leadership change within his company and home. Instead of deflecting, he spoke openly about the importance of recognizing unseen contributors. Without dramatizing personal missteps, he credited a long-serving member of his household for teaching him that loyalty sustains more than operations. It sustains identity. The comment circulated quietly through executive circles. Some interpreted it as strategic humility. Others recognized authenticity. Investors who once questioned his stability observed a steadier presence in his decisions. Business performance stabilized alongside his home. The merger he once feared collapsing regained momentum. Markets responded not just to numbers, but to renewed clarity. Privately, Harrison reflected on privilege and blindness. He examined how easily he had equated refinement with superiority, how subtly systemic bias had shaped his perception of value. He recognized that his wealth had insulated him from confronting uncomfortable truths. A lifetime of authority had narrowed his awareness in ways he had not previously questioned. He no longer viewed loyalty as guaranteed by contract, that he understood it as reciprocal protection. Something fragile. Something earned daily. One evening, as he walked through the living room, he paused before a framed photograph of his late wife that had been returned to its original place above the fireplace. The restoration felt symbolic, not only of memory but of humility. He acknowledged privately that wealth could construct buildings, acquire influence, and command attention, but it could not manufacture devotion. Devotion grew through respect, through acknowledgement, through shared endurance. Evelyn maintained clear boundaries despite her return. She did not revert to silent overextension. Her authority was balanced, her schedule defined. Harrison respected the distinction. Their relationship shifted from employer and subordinate to collaborators in safeguarding the emotional foundation of the home. Mutual understanding replaced assumption. Harrison became more attentive as a father. He adjusted his calendar, not because crisis demanded it, but because presence mattered. He attended school events without delegating representation. He initiated conversations without an agenda. Ariel's confidence gradually strengthened, reflected in improved academic performance and renewed creativity. The mansion regained warmth, not through decoration, but through rhythm. Evenings no longer felt mechanical. Conversations extended beyond logistics. Staff laughter returned in distant corridors. The house, once hollow despite brightness, now felt inhabited in spirit. Time passed. The sharp guilt Harrison once carried softened, but never vanished entirely. He accepted its presence as necessary memory. Growth, he realized, does not erase error. It transforms it into guidance. Years later, standing once again on the balcony overlooking Manhattan's skyline, Harrison reflected on the journey that had reshaped him. The empire below remained vast. The market still fluctuated. The board still demanded performance. Yet his measure of success had expanded beyond acquisition. He wondered how many invisible pillars he had once overlooked in other areas of his life. How many quiet contributors sustained systems he assumed were self-generating. How many decisions had been justified under the banner of efficiency without considering their human cost. The question lingered as the city lights shimmered beneath him. Redemption had arrived in time for his home. But as he looked out over the skyline, Harrison understood something deeper. Not every mistake announces itself before it is too late.